On the 14th of March, 1987, a sheriff in Harlan County, Kentucky, drove his cruiser to the base of a coal mine at 6:14 in the morning, earlier than anyone had asked him to, earlier than anyone expected. He'd gotten a call the night before. Someone from the morning crew. So they'd found something. Wouldn't say what. Just said the law needed to come before anyone else did. What he walked into that morning made him file his resignation letter before sundown. He never explained why. He moved out of the county 4 days later and refused to speak about what he'd seen for the next 31 years. For 31 years, that silence was the only answer Harlan County received. And the question it left behind wasn't complicated. It wasn't procedural. It was this: what does a man encounter that makes 22 years of carrying a badge feel like the wrong thing to be holding? A coal mine in eastern Kentucky doesn't sound like the beginning of anything important. It sounds like the kind of place where big stories end, not where they start. Every week in a county like Harlan, someone calls in something from the old corridors. A dead animal, a collapsed section, trespassers making use of the dark. This particular sheriff had handled dozens of those calls over 2 decades. He'd walked into worse situations than a mine shaft. He'd never once considered resigning over any of them. Harlan County in 1987 was the kind of place where institutional weight had accumulated in layers going back generations. Coal money, political families, federal attention that came and went in waves, never quite resolving anything, never quite leaving either. The county had its own logic: who you knew, what you owed, what you didn't ask about. A sheriff operating in that environment understood certain things without needing them explained. He knew which calls were routine. He knew which ones weren't. This was the kind of call you didn't refuse. Operating partially since 1959, the mine had become a fixture of the county's working life. By 1987, only its uppermost 2 tunnels were still active. The lower corridors, numbered 3 through 7, had been sealed in 1972 following a methane incident that killed 2 workers and injured 11 others. The company's public position was unambiguous. Nothing remained in those depths. The tunnels were structurally compromised. Nobody went in. Nobody had reason to. That was the official position. What multiple sources, speaking independently across a span of years, later claimed to have found in the 4th corridor suggested that someone had, in fact, been going in, not recently, possibly for decades. Someone pulled the call log from that previous night out of the county dispatch system. It disappeared in the window between March 14th and March 17th. 3 days in which the record of why a law enforcement officer drove to a sealed mine before sunrise was quietly removed from everything that could be officially examined. When a journalist submitted a records request 6 months later, the trail had already gone cold. No incident report, no case number, no documentation of any kind placing the sheriff at those tunnels that morning, except for the memories of the people standing in the parking lot when he walked back out. Former residents of Harlan County remember it differently than the official silence implies. According to accounts that surfaced gradually over the following years, at least one person was present in that lot when the sheriff reemerged from a mine access road. Multiple people in separate conversations across separate decades described the same image. A man walking slowly, not injured, not panicked, moving at the pace of someone who had decided somewhere in the dark that urgency no longer applied to him. His uniform was clean. He hadn't disturbed a single thing down there. He had walked in, stood still, understood what he was looking at, and walked back out. When asked what was down there in the darkness, his answer came in 3 words: "You don't want to know." Then he drove directly to the county clerk's office, left his badge on the desk without explanation, and told whoever was on duty that morning to inform the county judge he was finished. No statement, no scene, just a badge on a desk and a man walking to his car. That's when the story changes. Because what people across Harlan County have described, in fragments across decades, through layers of rumor and secondhand account, isn't a single coherent thing. It's several overlapping impressions of the same space, offered by people who never compared notes and arrived at similar conclusions anyway. Whether that convergence means something real, or whether it simply reflects how stories move through closed communities until they harden into fact, is a question this narrative cannot settle for you. Former miners who worked the upper corridors in the years before the 1972 closure recalled anomalies that, at the time, hadn't registered as significant. Sounds from the lower tunnels during overnight shifts. Not the settling sounds of old rock, but rhythmic, periodic sounds with a mechanical quality that had no business coming from sealed corridors. Electrical demand spikes that the site foreman logged and never explained. A section of mine road near the old 4th Corridor access point that was resurfaced in the winter of 1969 by a crew none of the on-site workers recognized, driving equipment with no company markings. Small details, the kind you file away not because they make sense, but because they stick. Former crew members also recalled a private surveying team being dispatched into the lower corridors in 1989, 2 years after the sheriff's resignation. According to residents with direct knowledge of that operation, the team carried explicit instructions: document nothing found below the 2nd level, and report only to a single liaison whose identity was withheld from the crew itself. What they encountered, in the account that has traveled farthest through the county, were the structural remains of something built into the 4th Corridor's walls. Not geological formations, not equipment abandoned during the 1972 closure. A construction, something engineered into the rock at a depth the company's own records insisted no one had touched in 15 years. Take a moment with that. A corridor sealed after a fatal incident in 1972, declared structurally compromised, officially empty, and inside it, according to multiple independent claims, something that someone designed, built, and never came back to remove or explain. Not mining infrastructure, not waste storage, something else entirely. Something that required deliberate work to put there and deliberate silence to keep there. In 2018, the sheriff finally spoke, once and only to a researcher who had spent several years quietly reconstructing the history of the mine and the county surrounding it. He agreed to speak on one condition: nothing would be published while he was still alive. He died in February of 2019. The researcher released a summary of their conversation the following year. She described the interview as unlike anything she had conducted in years of regional work. He was composed, unhurried. He narrated events with the tone of a man describing something that had happened to someone he used to know, detached, clear, stripped of the emotional texture you'd expect from a story that cost him his career and his home county. He told her that what he found in that mine was not something that belonged there. He told her it bore no relation to any mining operation. And when she asked about the aftermath, about what happened when he reported what he'd seen, she recounted his response with particular care. He contacted the appropriate state office. They informed him that he had not seen anything. He had not seen anything. That response has stayed with everyone who has looked closely at this case. Not because institutional denial is unusual, it isn't, but because of the character of it. Not confusion, not a request for documentation, not a standard bureaucratic hold while someone figured out the proper channel. An immediate, composed answer. He had not seen anything. The kind of response that isn't written on the spot, the kind that was already prepared. The third layer of this story is the least verifiable and the one that consistently refuses to disappear. An anonymous post surfaced on a regional history forum in 2016, never confirmed, never traced to anyone willing to be identified. It claimed that what occupied the fourth corridor was documentation, physical files stored in a section of tunnel that had been reinforced and partially climate controlled by someone operating well outside the business of extracting coal. The post described papers dating back as far as the 1940s. It described contents that would have been, the word it used was catastrophically damaging to individuals who were, in March of 1987, still living and still holding institutional authority in the county and the state above it. The deeper the inquiry went, the less the official silence held its shape. Interpretation divided into three rough directions. The first pointed inward to purely corporate motivations. Mine owners using sealed tunnels to warehouse evidence of environmental violations, falsified safety records, liability they couldn't risk surfacing in an era of increasing regulatory pressure. The kind of paper trail you store underground because destroying it leaves residue, and residue invites questions. While that reading fails to explain a structure built into sealed rock, it cannot be dismissed on those grounds alone. The second pointed outward and further back in time. Beginning in the 1940s, certain federal agencies made documented use of remote industrial sites across rural Appalachia for storage, for communications infrastructure, for coordination that benefited from not appearing on any public ledger. The sites that have been confirmed share a profile, industrial cover, geographic remoteness, and workforces conditioned by culture and economics to treat institutional secrecy as ordinary. Not every location used for these purposes has been publicly named. The argument is not that this mine was among them. The argument is narrower, that the same geographic profile, the same era, and the same pattern of official silence appeared in places that have since been confirmed, and the absence of confirmation here is not the same as the absence of activity. The third interpretation was simpler and more local. That what was stored there was neither corporate liability nor federal infrastructure, but something more personal. The ledger of arrangements between powerful county figures whose names still appear on public buildings, and whose families remained in positions of influence well into the following decades. That the corridor wasn't a hiding place for an organization. It was a hiding place for a relationship. Every answer generates three more. That is either the signature of a genuine mystery or the signature of a story designed to resist conclusion. Possibly both. The researcher was asked in a later conversation whether she believed him. She said she'd spent 3 hours with the man. He was the least theatrical interview subject she'd encountered in years of regional work. He didn't perform the story. He didn't slow down on the extraordinary parts. He delivered the entire account in the same register throughout. Steady, slightly flat, the way someone describes damage to a vehicle they no longer drive. The processing, she said, had clearly been done a long time ago. What remained by 2018 was only the information itself. The detail she returned to most had nothing to do with the mine. It came near the end of the interview, when she asked whether he regretted leaving. He said he didn't regret leaving. The only thing he still carried, he told her, was this: that he'd stood in that corridor long enough to understand what he was looking at. If he'd turned around 30 seconds sooner, he could have walked out not knowing. And the state office would never have needed to call and inform him that he hadn't seen what he'd seen. That was what he thought about, he said. Well, he thought about it at all. By 2003, a remediation crew arrived with concrete and sealed every documented entrance to the lower corridors under an abandoned mine closure program. The company that filed the paperwork was a subsidiary of a subsidiary, a corporate structure assembled with the apparent shelf life of a convenience. Someone dissolved that entity formally the following year, once the remediation was processed and the record was filed and closed. No confirmed account places anyone inside that fourth corridor since at least that year. The most probable explanation, the one that fits the widest range of evidence, is that a man found something powerful interests had buried, assessed the personal cost of pursuing it, and made a rational calculation to leave rather than fight. It's an unglamorous reading. It happened in counties like Harlan in the 1980s with a regularity that official history tends to compress into footnotes. But a construction built into sealed rock is not explained by document storage. The federal activity pattern in the surrounding region doesn't resolve into something clean, and the quality of that final account, not frightened, not outraged, simply settled into a certainty that had nowhere left to go, doesn't match the emotional profile of a man who found someone's financial records and decided the county wasn't worth living in anymore. Which brings everything back to the same place. If the official position was always that those lower corridors were empty, if no record acknowledged any presence below the second level after 1972, then what demands explanation is not what was inside the mine. What demands explanation is what happened when the sheriff picked up the phone to report it. Not uncertainty on the other end. Not a request for documentation. Not a delay while someone consulted a supervisor. A prepared answer. Immediate. Settled. Already written. That kind of response doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a system that knew what was in that corridor, understood that discovery was always possible, and had language ready for exactly this phone call. That requires infrastructure. It requires coordination. It requires someone somewhere who had been expecting that call long before it came. The full record of the researcher's interview has never been publicly released. She has said, on more than one occasion, that she is still deciding whether the time is right. She has been deciding for 6 years.